Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time, it's a return for one of my most popular previous guests, whose wisdom always gives the listener figures a big boost. So, no pressure then, as I welcome you back to the show, Professor Rob Ford.
Well, it's very flattering, Mark. I'll do my best to live up to it.
I will be poring over the numbers later, don't you worry. But one thing we've discussed when you've been on the show before, Rob, is the mix of long term trends in Britain that are taking our society, at least, in a more liberal direction. So, before we come on a bit more to talk about politics now and where it might go, let's start with a quick recap. What are those sort of liberalising trends that are shaping our society?
Well, I think there were three big ones. When we were discussing before, this was all laid out in my book with Maria Sobolewska, Brexit Land. And the three big ones that we talk about, the kind of mega trends, are firstly the rise and rise and rise of university education. So amongst the youngest cohorts now, regularly 40 to 50% end up going through HE in some form. Secondly, rising ethnic diversity. Now, ethnic minorities are not socially liberal necessarily in every single respect, but on many important aspects of openness to the world, attitudes towards identity and its porousness and so on, they tend to be more liberal. And the experience of diversity also can encourage liberal attitudes amongst the majority group as well. And then the third one is generational change, partly because of higher university education levels and greater ethnic diversity amongst younger cohorts. But also, even accounting for that, what we tend to see is that younger cohorts tend to hold more socially liberal values on lots of different items, lots of different measures than older cohorts did. So those are the big three: education, diversity, generational change.
And I guess the thing that's maybe worth adding is that there's a lot of momentum behind those, as it were. So although the proportion of teenagers going to university has sort of plateaued, it's so much higher than it was when, say, you or I were kids, that there's still going to be a rise in the proportion of the population that are graduates for a good long time yet, because that will take many decades in a way to work its way through the whole population, won't it?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Any process that is generational and demographic tends to be both slow and relentless, kind of like glacial erosion, as I learned about in geography. You can't see it happening, but you can see the effect on the landscape once it has worked its way through. So even if we were to get some kind of uber reform government that completely stopped immigration, slashed the universities, which would be obviously bad news for me, and attempted to instill more socially conservative values in the electorate. Just the momentum of what's already there in the system, the difference between the average 18-year-old cohort and the average 85-year-old cohort would mean we would carry on moving in a liberal direction on all three of these dimensions for decades from where we are now, because if you think about the world in which the average 70-year-old grew up in compared to the world the average 20-year-old is experiencing, that's the momentum right there, is the difference between those two experiences. So it's got a long way to run.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't feel particularly old, but you only have to be one generation prior to me for all sorts of very public and official forms of racism to have been sort of the norm and not particularly controversial. It is really striking thinking back how much the world has changed since my childhood, let alone since the era before my childhood. But all of that obviously could just be a bit of sort of comfort food for any liberals to think, oh, brilliant, everything's going in the right direction, hooray, everything's going to turn out all right. Which obviously isn't quite how politics have felt in the last few years. If you were to say what have been the most dramatic political successes, I guess, Lib Dems like me would make an argument for sticking Ed Davey in the 2024 general election campaign for my party somewhere in the list. But you would definitely put Brexit, Nigel Farage, prominently in the list. Very long run of Conservative, election wins. They are in such trouble now that maybe their record as being probably the most successful sort of political party in a Western democracy might be about to come to an end. But it hasn't, but up until now, it doesn't feel like liberals have had a particularly great run of it in our politics. So how come, if the glaciers are eating away steadily in the liberal direction, what's been, well, going right or wrong, from depending on your perspective as to who you would like to see come out on top?
Well, I think I'm going to start by just flagging up a couple of things from the last election. I know we're going to talk a lot about the last election later on, but I think it just helps to make the point I'll then go on to make. So, two things about the last election that don't get as much attention as we might expect is it was the first general election ever fought by an ethnic minority major party leader as prime minister as well,
Mm.
Rishi Sunak. You had in the previous parliament the first, second, and third, I think, ethnic minority chancellors, the first and second ethnic minority foreign secretaries, the first, second, and third ethnic minority home secretaries, two of whom were the same person, Whether Braverman, in two stints.
There's a lot about the last few
And
years, that statistic.
and post that election, according to Pink News, the Labour Party backbenches constitute the largest cohort of openly gay legislators anywhere in the world.
Mm.
And I mention both of those things because no one mentions both of those
Mm.
things, because they are just not seen as particularly remarkable or interesting elements of our politics, which I think is one of the great paradoxes of liberalizing social change, is that as things that would have been remarkable to an earlier generation become normal, then the front of cultural argument moves on. So liberalism won, but the victory has just disappeared in a sense. The victory is that it's just normal that we had an ethnic minority prime minister contesting the election and, dozens and dozens of openly gay MPs. Now, if you were Chris Smith, the first openly gay MP, what was it, 30, 35 years ago,
Mm.
this would be a remarkable development. If you were, I mean, Diane Abbott would be quite happy, I'm sure, to recount that this is a remarkable development in terms of how I think politics has changed. So, in many respects, one of the resolutions to the paradox is because the fight never stays on the same front in the world of liberal versus conservative. It is always a relative argument. And actually, in many respects, we are much more liberal than we were 30 or 40 years ago. But why doesn't it feel that way? Well, obviously, because the relatively conservative side seems to be winning relatively often. And I think that comes down to a couple of big things about the way conservative politics has developed in the past decade, which is basically unity and mobilization. Uh, the problems that liberals have is that they're not worked up enough and they're too fragmented relative to their opponents. So, another paradox of the 2019 election was that most of the people voting in that election were Remainers, but obviously a Leave party won a majority. And the reason was because Leave voters ultimately cared more about getting their agenda enacted and were therefore more willing to unify, at least as it turns out, very temporarily, behind someone who said that they were going to deliver that particular agenda. And we see the same kind of paradox in terms of the politics of immigration. On most measures, not all, we can get into that if you want later on, but on most measures, attitudes towards immigration are more liberal than they were 30 years ago.
Mm.
And yet we have the most electorally successful anti-immigration party. We have some really very openly anti-immigration, openly racial rhetoric appearing in our politics. Perhaps an example actually of the tide of progress seeming to reverse in the past few years. But then when you go and look at the opinion polling, as both of us love to do, you will see that those kinds of attitudes are not becoming more prevalent in the electorate. They are still very, very narrow minority views. And the resolution to that is because the people who really dislike immigration care about it a lot more than people who just think of it as, one of those phenomena of everyday society. So the anti-side is more mobilized, it's louder, it's more unified behind Reform the UK. You see this now in the Mori salience data, where we see, I think, someone was asking me this on Blue Sky, Mike, you might know the answer. This might be the largest ever partisan divide in salience for as long as Mori has been asking that question since the 1970s, where you've got, with Reform UK, the biggest party, 75+% of Reform UK voters saying immigration is a top issue for them. versus for Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, it's not even in the top five. It's like
Mm,
10 to 15, it's not like a non-issue for them. It's like 10 to 15% are saying it's an issue, but it's right down the list. So to have an issue that, for reform voters now, immigration is as important as COVID was for everybody else in the middle of the pandemic. That's extraordinary.
mm.
And that is not a view that's shared by everybody else. And that I think is what accounts for this paradox. It seems that certain kinds of hot button identity and diversity and liberal versus socially conservative issues really exercise one side of the divide while completely not bothering the other side. And that means, you get mobilization on one side, but not enough counter mobilization the other way. And that's going to pull the system in the direction of the people who are mobilized and organized and vocal, which is what I think we're seeing happening.
Yeah, and I guess, it's maybe slightly too glib to say that sort of hate trumps tolerance, but it's a lot easier to get worked up and passionate and motivated by something that you dislike than by the sense of being, gently pleased that other people are able to do their own thing. And I guess we saw that a bit with the legalization of same-sex marriage, where in fact public opinion has shifted massively to be, hugely supportive of it as a measure overall. But it always was a lot easier in many ways for opponents of it to get worked up about it because this was something that was in a way threatening their way of life. Whilst for most supporters of equal marriage, it was the sense of, yeah, well, other people should be able to do what they want. And
Yeah,
that's never quite as motivating, is it?
yeah, and we're both old enough to have lived through that debate in real time and remember the calumnies that were coming from the right about how awful this was going to be and it was going to destroy marriage as a social institution and there would be huge uprisings against it. And none of that happened. Everyone was just like, okay, that's fine. And within a few years, it was a non-issue.
Mm,
I mean, I think immigration is rather different to that, and we can get into
mm,
to why. But I think that a lot of social issues do have that quality. And I think I would iterate what you said about hate versus tolerance slightly and say I think the negative emotions in politics, hate, fear, anxiety, they're just more they're hotter emotions, they're more motivating emotions than the positive emotions in politics. And tolerance, of course, is perhaps even just the absence of it. So when we tolerate something, even more so when we think of something as just normal, we're not really motivated about it. I think one of the interesting things that's actually happening in America since Trump's re-election is a lot of things that people have taken for granted as normal are no longer things they can take for granted. And there you are
mm.
starting to see, I think, a motivated response to that. In a weird sort of way, it's a very small c conservative reaction. You don't really mobilize to defend the things you take for granted until suddenly you think they might go. And then all of a sudden you think, no, actually, these are things I value and I want to defend them. But until that point arrives, when it's still in the abstract, then the side that wants to smash the stuff up, that's angry about it and exercise about it, has a big advantage over you.
Yeah, it's there's an interesting parallel there actually with the book Must Labour Lose that came out after Labour had lost three general elections in a row after the sort of Clement Attlee government. Now, as it turned out, that book was in a way spectacularly wrong because
Books with
then
titles like that tend to be leading indicators of a party being
of
about.
the opposite being about to happen, because what was it? Labour then went on to win four of the next five general elections. But I mean, it is rightly a classic, partly because I think it was one of the first of those sort of, opinion poll based sort of strategic political scene setting books. But one of the arguments it makes about how socialism would have to change for, Labour to have a chance of winning again is that the big dangers that had motivated Labour and had motivated people to vote for Labour, things like the fear of unemployment, the fear of poverty, that through the creation of the welfare state and the introduction of Keynesian demand management had largely abated. And the problem then was, well, what motivates our side now if we've sort of won? Now, obviously, given what we know about the story of Britain in subsequent years, feeling that you've won over poverty, unemployment, recession in the 50s feels a rather optimistic, maybe even slightly naive point of view. But it's that same thing. It was that sense of, well, those things we used to fear, we've won, so they're no longer motivating us, and hence a gap. Now, Labour did, however, find an answer to that, which perhaps should give people optimism that answers can be found to this challenge. But as you say, I think at the heart of it is immigration. And as you say, I think the figures at the moment are really strikingly polarized. I guess what I'm not so sure about, be interested to hear what your take is on this, is it that the population is more polarized in its views over immigration than it has been on this or other issues previously? Or is it that the existence of reform means that the people who are really concerned about the issue are mostly all backing one particular party? So it's a sort of sorting by party label that makes these figures look so dramatic. Or is it really that the underlying population is much more polarized than ever before?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. It's a very academic answer, of course. I mean, when we look, I mean, I am incidentally just going to make a sort of methodological aside. I'm sure like bar charts listeners will love one of those.
Absolutely.
Um, I think there is a problem in discussion of immigration attitudes, which is that everyone in what is also a very highly polarized debate on, say, the public opinion of immigration tends to pick their favorite measure, and the different measures have different strengths and weaknesses. So, if you take, for example, the measure about is immigration too high, people say, "Oh, look at that! It's not polarized at all. Everyone thinks immigration is too high." You'll get like 75, 80% of people saying immigration's too high. So, I mean, a measure like that, the numbers game measure, as I like to call it, people will say, well, that shows everyone's always been pretty anti-immigration, which is kind of true, but also like when you realize if you track that measure all the way back into the 1980s when net immigration was negative and inflows into the country were very low, you get 80%, 90% saying yes to that then as well. So, I mean, it's not that the measure doesn't tell you anything. The people who don't say immigration is too high, they're liberal in all sorts of other ways versus the people who do. It's just it's not telling people what they think it tells them. It doesn't really seem to track actual overall immigration levels in any meaningful sense. It's more like, do you think immigration is a good or bad thing in some sort of vague general sense? Then, if you take other questions that are more specific about like the impacts of immigration, is it good or bad for the economy? Is it good or bad for culture? You tend to get lower levels of people saying bad overall, and you get sort of about it's sort of an even split these days. You get the positive chunk and the negative chunk, and then if you take something like salience, which we discussed before, you see that's much more responsive to overall levels. I'm making this point just to illustrate that I think it's very dangerous to just fixate on one measure. You've got to
Mm.
take the measures in a round. Now, if we take the measures in the round, what we do see is that most of them have moved mostly in a liberal direction in the long run over the last 20 years. But there has been an abrupt reversal in the last couple of years with the biggest shift on the salience measure. But we also see a lot more social polarization on these measures than we used to. And it's those big factors that we talked about at the beginning. It's education, it's generation, it's ethnic diversity. So younger voters, graduates, people with migrant and minority heritage all tend to be more positive about immigration and less worried about it, less likely to say it's way too high. Whereas older, socially conservative voters who didn't go to university from the white majority group, particularly if they sort of say that they strongly identify as ethnically white British and so on, they tend to be more negative. And those differences have always existed, but they got bigger.
Yeah.
So it
And
is more polarized, even though on balance, relative to say 25 years ago, the average is more liberal. There's more polarization around that average. But also, what we have seen is that these are now much more predictive of support for one particular
mm,
party. So we have reform at 25, 30% in the polls, a phenomenon for which there is no precedent in modern British politics, no precedent in the era of mass opinion polling. And immigration attitudes, for as long as Nigel Farage has had a party to lead, and he's had a few, immigration attitudes have always been the strongest predictor of support for the parties that he leads. It was true with UKIP, it was true with the Brexit Party, and it's true with Reform UK. So I think both aspects of your point are true. Yes, it's more polarized. Yes, it's more mobilized. But the polarization and the mobilization seem to be two trends running together rather than being one being the product of the other. But coming on to something that I suspect we will discuss later on, it does present a challenge for Reform UK in that they've got a very naturally mobilizable core electorate, but then there's a big chasm between that group and the rest of the electorate in terms of their appeal.
And I think there's also a question about what will happen to immigration numbers and hence possibly also people's views towards immigration in the next few years. I think because if one wanted to be a really die-hard optimistic liberal, desperately looking for some positive signs in the shift in the polls in the last couple of years, I guess you would revert to saying, well, yes, in a way, numbers have moved, against immigration as immigration numbers have increased hugely. But given just how massively net immigration numbers have gone up, in a way, the shift in the opinion polls is not that great because it's not when net immigration is at record highs, you might expect the views on immigration to have moved to record highs in terms of hostility or skepticism about immigration, and that hasn't happened. So although the numbers have definitely, the graph absolutely shows a very distinctive and important turning point, that perhaps as the numbers fade again, we'll end up in 10 years' time looking back on the graph and thinking, oh yeah, well of course, actually, that bump wasn't so big in the mid 2020s, was it? And of course, that shows how the underlying trends were still moving along.
Yeah, I mean, I should start, by making a kind of a little bit of a confession. I think intellectual humility is important in our line of work. I wrote a couple of reports a few years ago in the middle of the Brexit process, pointing out that immigration levels were going up a lot, but people seemed to be quite relaxed about this. And I thought maybe this was a turning point in the debate because of the longer run trends towards liberalism. Actually, from the point of view of 2025, that looks to have been over
Mm.
optimistic. We have seen a pretty substantial, highly mobilized backlash against the kind of Johnson spike in immigration numbers. But there are so many lags in this system, Mark, that I think people don't appreciate. I mean, when the most recent ONS migration statistics numbers were reported, listening to people debating them on the TV and the radio, they would constantly refer to this as the present level of migration. And it's not the present level of migration, it's the level of migration from a year before, which in turn was the product of policy from a year before that. So it's there's a 2 year kind of time zone difference between the immigration that people are
Mm.
discussing and the immigration that's actually happening because it takes time to land in terms of policy, it takes time to land in terms of statistics, and those lags just get forgotten. And that's important because I think immigration is a very mediated political issue. I think all political issues are mediated to some degree, but immigration particularly. And because of that, I think the narrative on this will likely shift in the next year or two because of things that have already happened, and that those of us like you and me who are very closely engaged with the political process are aware of, but haven't necessarily filtered out. And that potentially will put some downward pressure on the salience numbers and so on. But the reason that there's a voice in the back of my head that's being skeptical about that, aside from the fact that I was very publicly wrong about this once already, is that I do think the other thing that's very important about immigration as an issue, going all the way back, actually, going all the way back to, say, the 1960s, is it's very much a matter of narratives as well as numbers. It is not really ever, immigration as an issue in politics is never really about immigration overall. There's always some kinds of immigration that are way more politically contentious than other kinds of immigration. So in the original immigration debates of the 1960s, there were a lot more people coming from Ireland and Europe than were coming from the Commonwealth. But nobody was talking about them. They weren't visible in the debate. One of the very first survey experiments I ever came across was Gallup randomly splitting their sample and asking half about immigration from Ireland and half about immigration from the Commonwealth. Nobody cared about the immigration from Ireland. They only cared about the immigration from the Commonwealth. So this has long been the case. And what we can see in the current debate is it's the small boats migration that is now the salient element of this. And I'm not surprised by that because I think it hits some very strong hot buttons, red buttons with voters, not in terms of raw numbers, but in terms of the nature of the migration. People really dislike migration that they feel is about violating rules, is about jumping queues, quote unquote, is a sort of illustration of the government being unable to control the borders. So I think the small boat migration hits a lot of negative buttons for that reason. And I suspect even if the aggregate number continues to come down, the narrative focus will remain on that small boat migration. And so I think it's almost a necessary condition for the issue to get back to where it was in, say, the mid
Mm,
2000s or
mm,
something. Actually, that's not a good example. Maybe back to where it was 5 or 6 years ago would be for the level of attention to the small boat issue to go down, and for that to happen, the level of small boat migration would have to go down. That issue needs to be less visible in the news debate for the rest of the immigration debate. And it is paradoxical because it does feel like the tail wagging the
mm,
dog. With the small boats, we're talking about 50,000 people maybe a year. Immigration overall is 15, 20 times that, and most of that is not visible to people in the same way and doesn't bother them. And it often feels like migration policy towards all those other people is being set in part in response to anxieties that are about this small group. But that does seem to be the way that it's playing out at the moment. And so I suspect it won't necessarily require eliminating small boat migration because I think that's unachievable as a goal anyway. It's about somehow making it less newsworthy.
mm. Although I guess in that there is the implication that, in a way, what matters more to people is a sense of control than the numbers, and that's partly why the small boats is such an emotive issue. And I mean, I know you've made that argument before and have made it very persuasively. The slight doubt I always have when hearing you make that argument is whether saying that it's about control is the easy, polite answer that people give, and that actually, if there was control but numbers otherwise the same, that people who currently say, "Oh well, it's the lack of control that is what angers motivates me," would go on to come up with some, and whether they're being honest with themselves at the moment, or whether they're being, maybe they're fooling themselves, or maybe they're deliberately feeling a little bit coy about what they say to, say, an opinion pollster, that they will just move on to say something else if there was control.
Well, I mean, I think this isn't even really an abstract argument to make anymore in one sense, in that we've had a kind of natural experiment in the importance of numbers versus control in the past 5 to 10 years as a result of the way immigration policy has panned out. So we've had three substantial streams of humanitarian migration in the last, well, much of the last parliament, maybe back to, I forget when the Hong Kong business began, but migration from Ukraine, migration from Hong Kong, and small boats migration. And the first point to make about those three is that the small boats is the smallest of those three groups. But the other two groups involve specific bilateral policy frameworks agreed by our government with control exercise. And they were not newsworthy and they did not generate high levels of concern in public opinion polling. They did not come up in focus groups. If they did come up in focus groups, it was often positively valenced mentions that came up. Now, these are all people that are migrating for political reasons. In the case of Ukrainians in particular, they were fleeing conflict. These are all people that are coming here seeking refuge in some sense. But in two cases, there's a clear government framework of control and a sense that we have chosen to do this. Whereas in the case of small boats migration, there is a sense of a lack of control, that it's chaotic, that people are dying at sea and stuff, and that this is kind of being forced upon us. And the difference in the public reaction to those two things is like night and day, even though the numbers are much larger in the controlled case. So I feel that provides a powerful case study. So my question back to you would be, how could you account for that difference in how the public react to those different flows if it isn't about control?
Yeah. Well, I think the Hong Kong example is an important one, isn't it? Because I guess one possible answer, which the Hong Kong one doesn't neatly fit, I'll grant, is that it's to do with skin color, and that the typical image, however accurate or not, that people who say they are very concerned about immigration have of who is the sort of person who is an immigrant from Ukraine is quite different from the image they have of, as the sort of person they, is traveling on a small boat, and that the predominant difference is one of skin color.
Well, I mean, I do think race and racial attitudes, and I mean, the other factor that we really should foreground in all of this is religion and Islam and
Mm,
Islamophobia. I mean, the largest groups coming in terms of small boat migration tend to be Muslim.
mm,
We have decades of public opinion evidence showing that attitudes towards Muslims as a group are more negative than attitudes towards practically any other racial, religious,
Mm.
or ethnic group. And while those attitudes have improved over time, that distinction that sets Muslims
It's
apart as a
still got a
group.
long way to go.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, attitudes to all these groups have got more liberal, but Muslims are still set apart as the group who are seen as the most threatening, the most alien, the least likely to integrate, all of these kinds of problems. And, what we're seeing in this sort of more openly racialized rhetoric that we're seeing on the radical right is much like it does elsewhere in Europe. It's not a matter of race like it was in the 70s. It's a matter of culture and religion. So they fixate upon Muslims and Muslim countries and Muslim attitudes, Muslim practices very, very strongly. And so I suspect that is part of it. And of course, this would account for the Hong Kong difference because Hong Kong is not a Muslim country, so it wouldn't necessarily activate those kinds of feelings. But all of that said, I would come back to the point about polarization and
Mm.
liberalization. So this stuff does activate and mobilize people in the kind of maybe most intolerant
Mm.
third quarter of the electorate. But in the middle half of the electorate, what Sundar Katwala would call the
Mm.
balancers of public opinion,
Mm.
I think the control argument really matters with them. Rules, controls, government having a working
Mm.
system that treats everybody fairly but also delivers policy effectively, versus people sort of basically breaking the rules and violating the policy and there being no due process. That kind of stuff really matters for them. And these aren't necessarily people who are inherently activated and mobilized by these kind of identity and intolerance type tropes.
And coming back to your earlier point about different mobilization rates in the sort of thing that does maybe fire up those with a more liberal attitude to be more passionate on issues related to immigration is something like whether it's a humanitarian disaster or an invasion of a country, that's what gets you from the, as it were, the slightly abstract, vague, yes, this is a good thing, to, oh no, this is a really urgent thing that we need to do. We must
Mm,
let these
mm.
people be able to come to safety. We could talk about these topics for a lot longer, but as we have touched on, there was a general election last year, and I believe you may have a new book coming out, or be attempting to finish. So hopefully we'll have a new book coming out on that topic. So do tell me and the listeners about the new book.
Yes, yes, we do, Mark. It's been the sort of obsession of mine for most of this year. So the book that's coming is imaginatively titled the British General Election of 2024, and the titles are always very plain sliced bread because it's the latest in a hallowed tradition of books going all the way back to 1945 that was for a long time associated with David Butler, the so-called Nuffield election studies, and the remit of these books is to essentially set out a kind of first draft of history for each general election, in the immediate aftermath of it, talking to all of those in the parties, analysing the data and stuff like this. And the guy who founded it, who wrote the first one, or co-wrote the first one, R.B. McCullum, was doing it in order to combat the myths that form about every general election. Every party has myths about particular elections. The media have myths about particular elections, that things that take hold, narrative tropes. This was the khaki election, this was the whatever election. And we know, those of us who analyze voting behavior, public opinion, that there's always way more stuff going on than no election is ever just one thing. So the goal of these books is to provide people with a reference work that lays out all the facts and all the testimony so that 20 years from now, when we're like, what on earth happened in the 2024 election, you can go back to it and have a really good sense of these are the arguments that were made, these were the choices that were made, these were the results, stripped of all the mythology that will build up afterwards.
Now, regular listeners will know that I most like reading books about a particular general election after there has been another one, because always think that subsequent election gives you a really interesting perspective, and it really sifts the good from the mediocre in terms of books about, say, the 2017 election, if you know what happened in 2019. And so there's a whole load of stuff that was written in, certainly passably authoritative and high quality books about the 2017 election, which then ages horribly once you know the result of 2019. But I do promise not to wait 4 or 5 years before reading the book when it comes out, Rob. But for somebody like me, or I guess many listeners who will feel they followed the election quite closely and have probably already read, listened, heard about a lot about the election, particularly at the time, what are you hoping they'll get from the book?
Well, first of all, in the spirit of the point you've just made, Mark, if you go back and read our 2019 book, 2 points we make is that the Conservative coalition assembled in 2019 would be mighty difficult to hold together once Brexit was done. And secondly, that the Liberal Democrats had finally achieved a political geography that left them remarkably well placed to profit from Tory misfortune. And I feel both of those
Absolutely.
insights have aged like fine wine. So I thought I'd just bring them up again.
Definitely.
You've got to take your wins where you can
Yeah.
find them in terms of
Yeah. I
political.
should add, Tim Bale wrote the chapter on the 2019 election for the Ian Dale's compendium of general election histories. And again, that, to Tim's credit, has aged extremely well. So to be fair, sometimes absolutely that these accounts
Yeah.
do age very well.
So important to note, same author team this time, and we delivered the goods last time. So I'm hopeful that some of what we say will hold up. I mean, I think the thing. I mean, I'm probably an outlier now in the country. Me and my three co-authors and some of our contributors have probably spent an unhealthy amount of time continuing to dwell upon what happened last July, even as everybody else has moved on. For me, this year, most of this year, the world, the clock stopped on 4th of July. And I think already some of the things that were really very unusual about that election result in historical context have come to be normalized by what we have seen since. That was the election last year was the most fragmented result ever. It was the biggest distortionary effect from the electoral system ever in Britain, and I think one of the biggest ever anywhere in the world. It was the biggest collapse in a single party's vote any in any British election ever, going all the way back to the era before the universal franchise, breaking a relatively recently set record that I fear you may well know all too well. I won't upset Mark and the listeners
Please
by
don't
saying
dwell on it.
these were remarkable facts, and another one to take just the geography of the election. The record for the lowest winning share at constituency level was broken in I think 70 seats this time. As in the previous lowest winning share, there were like 70 seats for Labour, I think that is just. And I think something like 15 out of 20 of the lowest local winning shares ever were all in that election. So remarkable fragmentation, remarkable volatility, an extraordinary decline in the Conservatives. Another record, the lowest ever combined vote share for the top two parties. These things have all been kind of normalized because the polls have continued in that direction of fragmentation, volatility, and chaos. And as people do, I think everyone's kind of adapted to that and now treat that as normal. It's absolutely not normal in our system, none of those things. And I think the other thing about it is, we have a massive Labour majority, and the immediate reaction to that was, oh, well, now you've got a government that's extremely powerful. But it's the most unusual landslide majority, I think, in British political history, because never before have there been so many MPs sitting on really narrow majorities. Um, a relatively modest swing against Labour is enough to all but wipe out that colossal parliamentary majority. And I think we are seeing the effect of that manifesting in terms of the instability of the Labour backbenches, the willingness to rebel against anything that looks remotely unpopular, because all of them are looking over their shoulders constantly. So, long story short, I guess you can probably tell there are so many interesting aspects of this election. And of course, haven't even mentioned it and really should, the strongest performance in seat terms by the third party in over
Absolutely.
100 years. Which incidentally is completely undiscussed, but very important for the politics that we're going to have going forward, because some of the most secure MPs in the Commons right now are all sat with Lib Dem colours, lots and lots of ones with
Yeah, I mean the Lib Dem, the
40%.
number of Lib Dem MPs with large majorities is if even if the party only had MPs with majorities of 5,000 or more, it would have been a stonkingly good result for the party. I mean, I'm particularly struck by that because I remember John Curtis at I think it was British Polling Council organised event, just basically at the start of the general election campaign, being very down on Lib Dem prospects, and in particular saying, and even if the Lib Dems do manage to benefit from anti-Tory tactical voting, etc., get an okay number of seats, they will be, terribly, terribly small margins. And actually, when you dig into it, the number of Lib Dem MPs with very large majorities is absolutely massive. Of course, as 2015 showed, a large Lib Dem majority doesn't necessarily stick at the next election, but it is striking nonetheless. I guess the thing that is perhaps sort of on the day after the election that was probably least recognised about the result, but has become normalised quite quickly since, is how low Labour's overall vote share was. I think that did take a little while to sink in as more than, just a slightly quirky side effect, partly because, at least tracked in the opinion polls, whether or not that this is how reality moved, but at least tracked in the opinion polls, a lot of that slippage in the Labour vote came quickly and late in the campaign, and so it didn't really get the attention it
Yes,
would have done
yes, yes.
otherwise. But do you have a sense of whether that was really what happened, or is that in some way an artifact of maybe the polls in some way being inaccurate or something to do with the methodology?
I think a little bit of both, and I think this is a great example of where I think the books can be really valuable to, as it were, future generations. Because as you say, the kind of Labour on a third of the vote has become normalised very quickly. At the start of that short campaign, we would have been surprised by under 40% based on where the polls were. One of the things that has completely not been discussed about that short campaign is that, taken purely objectively in terms of who went up and who went down over the campaign, that was a bad campaign for Labour.
Mm.
They lost a lot of ground. A worse campaign than 2019 when the Conservatives were basically static. Obviously, a lot worse than 2017 when Labour went up a great deal. Probably worse than 2015 when the polls didn't really move in the campaign, although it's a hard comparison to make because we know there were all sorts of issues with the polls in 2015, and worse than 2010 when Labour recovered a lot of ground. So you've got to go back a long way actually to find a campaign. 2005 is probably the last campaign where Labour lost a lot of ground to the Lib Dems. That was Iraq and everything. So there are some other parallels there. But people now, because of the result and the landslide, they're like, oh, this was a very successful campaign. Well, in terms of votes won and lost in the short campaign, it absolutely wasn't. But point number two, I think everyone within Labour is kind of aggressively relaxed about that in a kind of sense, in that number one, they always felt that the public polling was inflating their numbers. So they had themselves priced in a degree of polling error. One of the unusual things about this campaign was, I think this has been a kind of iterative process, but we're now at the point where the private polling operations that Labour and the Conservatives are doing internally are a long way away from the public polling that everybody else is getting. It's no longer just a case of they're commissioning a pollster to do some polls for them, although they do that as well. They're building their own polls, they're building their own statistical models from raw data, and they always had themselves lower. So that meant that they were less shocked by what they saw. But I think the other thing about this, which again has been forgotten so quickly, is Labour were seeking to recover from the worst
Mm.
result since 1935 in seat terms. And from the very beginning and very openly, their team's strategy was it's seats, not votes. We
Mm.
don't care about getting a particular vote share. We care about getting the votes that matter most in the places that matter most. Now, I don't think they realised quite what a price they would pay in their safe seats in pursuing that strategy. I think they were taken by surprise by that. But we should not forget, as it were, after time in terms of the fact that this was the risk that they deliberately took. That we are only going to get from 200 seats to 400 seats by all but ignoring the 200 seats that we already have. And if that means people go elsewhere, well, then that's just a risk we have to take because there's no other way to win. So I do think that it has become priced in, and I do think it was more of a surprise than people remember, and I do think it was a worse Labour campaign in objective terms than people seem to narrate it as. It's treated as a very successful campaign. Also, I think because it's contrasted with the very chaotic Tory campaign, they were also going down in the polls. But if you just look at that Labour line in isolation, and if you were to put that line to people as a kind of Rorschach test and say, is that a successful campaign or a failed campaign? They will say that's a failed campaign. That line just goes down goes down the whole time.
But I guess that touches on this question about to what extent is a party standing in the on national vote share in the opinion polls the right measure of success or failure. And I think for the Lib Dems, we went very sort of hardcore on no, that's completely the wrong measure. And I think for the Lib Dems or other smaller parties, so this, what I'm about to say would also apply, say, to the Greens or probably, the new Corbyn party, assuming that manages to sort of launch successfully in the end and find a name and the like, is that, the relationship between seats and votes under first past the post, if you're a smaller party, is so loose that the national vote share isn't really a helpful indicator. And indeed, you saw that it was justified by events, for the Lib Dems in 2024, that our vote share was up slightly on 2019, still well below the vote share, say, for the Alliance in 1983, but in terms of seat numbers, way, way ahead of all of those previous benchmarks. I think if you're aiming to be the government, it's harder to make that argument, but perhaps we should give that argument a bit of credence, because I guess if you view Labour as having fought two different campaigns for the general election, one about saying we're really going to try to win the seats that matter, and secondly, we're going to try to hold our own elsewhere, but it doesn't really matter if we get a bit beaten up elsewhere, like, in our safest seats. They got a bit more beaten up than they expected, but they did even better than they expected in the other. Actually, maybe net overall, that is a success rather than a failure, even if those two combined together give you a line that goes down on the graph.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think this is one of those questions where I think, in a way, our sort of internationally peculiar electoral system plus the fragmentation we now have, this makes this a much more interesting question than it might be in a pure two-party system or in a proportional system, because there is a really difficult trade-off that has several dimensions to it in terms of, do you care about national vote share or do you care about seats? I mean, at the bluntest level, you care about seats because that's how you have power in the Commons. That's how you have influence. That's true if you're a smaller party. It's true if you're a party that's aspiring to government. So when the team around Starmer were saying it doesn't matter that we got 33% because we've got 400 seats, well, yeah, they pass legislation. They can pass legislation because they have those 400 seats. But on the other hand, the way that their MPs are behaving is in part dictated by the fact that they didn't get a high enough vote share. The fact that there's no cushion in the polling for them in the difficult period at the start of government is because they didn't get a high enough vote share. And there are kind of more subtle iterations of this argument as well, because the strategy you pursue when pursuing seats is different necessarily, or it could be different to the strategy you pursue when you are pursuing a big vote share. Maybe you're more risk averse, maybe you're more localized, maybe your message is less clear. All of these were accusations leveled at the Labour Party versus a big ambitious message that tries to resonate more broadly and give a clear sense of who you are. And so I think, even if one is to say, 33% and 400 seats is a better outcome in all sorts of ways than 38% and no majority, or whatever it might be, it still comes with a significant price to pay. In terms of the cushion your MPs have locally, in terms of the degree to which you have a kind of bought-in electorate that will stick behind you, and in terms of the general sense the public have of what you are about. And then to turn it around in terms of smaller parties, I think the Lib Dem strategy was clearly optimal to them in terms of a once in a century seat result. But the reform strategy, which netted them 5 seats, one of which they quickly lost for other reasons, was also optimal for them in terms of a two-election strategy, which they were quite open about it being. They had to get to a kind of 20%, or not even 20%, 15% and no seats staging point, kind of base camp, in order to launch an assault on the Conservatives and try and become the largest party of the right. So I think if you're a small party that aspires to become a big party, you have to, at some point, have a strategy that's totally electorally suboptimal under first past the post, because you've got to kind of go through that valley of total inefficiency in order to reach the higher peak of being the governing party.
Yeah, although the that wasn't the Lib Dem pattern from 2019 to 2024 that we did hit our best result for a century without having gone for the I mean, I guess to an extent, 2019, I mean, our vote share did go up while our seat number fell back a bit, but it
It
wasn't
was the
particularly
biggest increase in the Lib Dems' overall vote share since they became one party in 1992, I
amazing.
believe. And also, I mean, actually it wasn't a trade-off because that vote share increase was highly concentrated in a set of seats, which then gave you
Mm,
a target seat list. And in a sense, you could think of the Reform two election strategy as like the same thing turned up to 11. You know, they've
mm,
come second in lots and lots of places now and got to the position where they're
mm.
being taken
Yeah,
seriously in the national conversation. And now they use that as a springboard onwards. So, I mean, I guess another way of putting it is that there is never any single right answer to the question, do you want to focus on votes or do you want to focus on seats? And in fact, for most parties, most of the time, there could be two or three strategies that could be very cogently argued for, depending upon what time horizon
yeah,
you're thinking about, depending upon what sort of price you're willing to pay. So we shouldn't, for example, think that because Labour got from 200 to 400 seats on 33% of the votes, that was the only or even the optimal way for them to approach that election. It was a strategy that proved to be, in that context, stunningly successful, but it could have been that there were other
yeah,
strategies
yeah.
that would get them to a more solid 350, for example, or that won over more conservative votes directly, even if it didn't deliver more seats and therefore gave them a kind of more solid base to make their unpopular decisions from. You know, that there were other options available because once you've got five parties competing under first past the post in a fragmented environment, it's just a very complicated problem. I don't think, this is one problem ChatGPT is not going to be able to solve for us.
But MRPs will be able to, we hope. I mean, that certainly is, it's very helpful that there has been this rise in a new polling methodology just
Yes.
in time to give us something that, if the models turn out, to have a good election next time round, through this parliament, will maybe give us a more helpful judge of what's going on than the national vote share figures will, because it's certainly if Labour begins to recover a bit in the polls, and governments very often do in the second half of a parliament, if they do begin to recover a bit, then we'll definitely get into that territory where it is plausible that the vote share and the seat tally stories start diverging. At the moment, everyone who is down on both, and everyone who's up is up on both pretty much. With the Lib Dems, it's a little more nuanced than that. But if we only had national vote share polls to go by and not MRP models at the moment, you wouldn't get, be drawing that much difference of a picture. But that could change, very significantly, later in the parliament. So thank goodness we have the MRP polls, and let's hope that the MRP polls continue to have a fairly good record, or at least the best of them continue to have a
Yeah, I
fairly
mean,
good
I
record.
think the MRPs are incidentally one of the reasons that Labour's decline in the national opinion polls didn't really get picked up in the
Mm,
campaign last year because the MRPs were just holding steady it. They're going to have a huge landslide. I also think the other thing with the MRPs over the course of a parliament rather than a short campaign is we know now from having had them for a few election cycles that a lot of the local variation, particularly from things like tactical voting, only really crystallizes quite late
mm,
because it's only quite late that people actually start looking at their local environment. So the MRPs right now, where there's this kind of uniformity between votes and seats, that could partly be an artifact of the fact that people aren't thinking in terms of their local constituency yet, and probably won't for several years.
Although that is a reason I think for Lib Dems to feel pretty bullish that the MRPs now have sort of settled down at the Lib Dem seat tally being roughly where it was the last general election, maybe a little bit higher, which, if that is before lots of tactical considerations have consolidated, that feels like that's actually a pretty good place for the Lib Dems to be in the numbers. But whether you wish to throw buckets of cold water on that or to encourage such bullishness from all of the work that you've done on the book and indeed through your whole life, what word of advice would you have for Lib Dems looking at the next few years?
Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting kind of slightly paradoxical moment actually for the Dems. Obviously, they just had their best ever result, well, best in living memory in seat terms, and I think there are a number of reasons to be bullish about their prospects of holding most of those seats. They aren't attached to an unpopular government, but they attract a similar kind of core electorate to that unpopular government. The Conservatives are their main opponents in most of the seats that they're defending, nearly all, in fact, and they are still completely on the canvas in voting terms. A contrast with Reform is probably even more beneficial to the Liberal Democrats than a contrast with the Conservatives. And of course, we've had one set of local elections already, and the Lib Dems did fantastically well in them. In fact, maybe we're seeing the first glimmers of what the next two-party system might look like in the form of Lib Dem versus Reform two-party
Certainly
politics
the
all the
council
way in the
by-election pattern
southwest.
is that, it's Reform and Lib Dems, we're neck
Yeah.
and neck as to how many seats we've won in council by-elections since May, and everyone else is a long way behind. But doubtless you'll have some academic reasoning as to why council by-elections are not a predictor of future politics.
Not just council by-elections. I mean, when you look at the main council elections in May, Cornwall, Devon, all the way down in the southwest, that sort of territory, like there was a wholesale replacement of, basically all the seats were won by Lib Dems or Reform. So that's the two-party politics in those town halls and county councils now. So all of those, I think, are reasons to be bullish about the Lib Dems consolidating their position where they are now. I guess. The devil's advocate question I would ask is when you've got an unpopular government and an untrusted opposition, this should surely be the kind of scenario in which we would expect the traditional third party to prosper. It is the kind of scenario in which the third party has prospered historically, all the way from the mid 70s through 83 with the SDP and everything like that through to 2005. This has been kind of peak Lib Dem type political climate. Yet it's not the Lib Dems who are prospering in this climate. It's Reform on one end, it's the Greens and potentially the Corbyn party on the other end. So I guess if I was a Lib Dem, the question that would keep me up at night and that I would worry about is are the parties on the radical poles of politics stealing all of our thunder? Are we missing this opportunity to actually become even bigger as a national force because we aren't seen as, an alternative as a receptacle for discontent in the way that we used to be? And does that then risk us, having a solid 50, 60 seats, but being condemned to being a kind of regional party and unable to expand beyond that? So, best of times, worst of
Yeah.
times, really.
Well,
More so,
and that also comes back to this question that I'm sure will be on lots of people's minds all the way through this parliament about to what extent is national vote share in the opinion polls a helpful metric? Because if you look at council by-elections or local elections, as we've just said, then absolutely the Lib Dems are prospering. It's not as if we're sort of out of the game in that respect at all. And indeed, in many council by-elections, it's places where we've not previously been strong. We've come through to make it a Reform versus Lib Dem battle. So I think, but in a way, this is the whole seats versus votes dilemma writ large. And I guess the big question for my party is seats did matter far more than votes in 2024. Is that therefore something that we should be emboldened by thinking is true for the future, or is a horrible moment of hubris going to happen at some point? Obviously, my own bet is much more on the former than the latter, but it would be foolish to ignore the risk of the latter.
Yeah, and but the other way of thinking about it, though, as well as seats versus votes, is elections. Is kind of wartime versus peacetime in terms of election campaigns versus the rest of the time. And I think one of the things that I'm sure must be very frustrating for the Lib Dems is the fact that they don't seem to be getting a great deal more coverage now with 70 plus MPs than they were getting previously with 1/5 of that number. And I guess the question is to what degree would that worry the party or matter? Do you need to be part of the day-to-day conversation? And because again, we have five-party politics now. In 2005, if the kind of media narrative was people don't like the government, they still don't trust the opposition, there's a third option. Then the third option is automatically at the table. But because there's three third options here, there's a kind of fight for the third spot in the spotlight, the fourth chair on Politics Live or whatever it might be, the voice that's neither government nor opposition. And it feels like in that peacetime political contest, the Lib Dems really are losing out at the moment to both Reform and the Greens to a lesser extent. And I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think that will decide many seats, but it might decide over a 10-year horizon? Like, how do you get into second place? You get into second place by being seen as relevant in places where you weren't before. And I think that can often be as much about building up that kind of catch-all discontent vote in peacetime periods. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I'm being very annoying by posing it as a question that's not easy to answer, but it does feel like that is a different element
Yeah. Well,
to
well,
the
let me do the academics thing of wrapping up by answering your question with another question, which is that, uh, yeah, if you were to say, well, okay, how do the Lib Dems grow to prosper in areas where we currently are some way off winning? One route, which in a way is the Reform 2024-2029 strategy, is you look to boost your national vote share as the first step to. The other route, which in a way was the Lib Dem 2019-2024 approach, is you build up your grassroots organization. And in that context, as long as the national view of your party and your leader is not hugely negative, what matters is what can you deliver organizationally in terms of the intensity of the campaigning locally. And the national vote share figures then end up being the trailing indicator rather than the leading indicator. But that again is doubtless to be debated and in the end to be decided in the ballot boxes over the next few years. But thank you hugely for your time, Rob. I will include links to pre-order your book in the show notes for everyone. And listeners can also find Rob's excellent email newsletter, which hopefully once the book is out the way, will pick up frequency once again. You can find Rob's newsletter at swingometer.substack.com, and Rob is on Blue Sky at robfordmanx.bsky.social, while I am markpackuk.bsky.social. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or review in your favorite podcast app. Thank you, everyone, for listening.